They called him a hero. The man who carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders, who stood for courage, loyalty, and strength. But what if I told you, the man behind that perfect smile was breaking quietly, piece by piece, while the world was too busy applauding to notice? Chris Evans. To the world, he was Captain America. To himself, he was a man trapped behind the mask of perfection. For years, fans saw the symbol of hope, the fearless soldier who could do no wrong. But behind the cameras, behind the interviews, behind the steady eyes and charming grin, lived someone who fought a very different kind of battle. One that had nothing to do with villains or war, but everything to do with peace of mind. Because the truth is, fame doesn't just change you. It consumes you. Chris Evans wasn't born to be a superhero. He was just a boy from Massachusetts, raised in a small town where dreams seemed too far, and fear was always closer. Acting, at first, wasn't about fame. It was escape, a way to silence the storm that lived inside his head. But when that escape turned into global recognition, the storm only grew louder. When Captain America, the first Avenger, released, everything changed overnight. Suddenly, Chris wasn't just an actor, he was a brand, an icon, a symbol of everything pure and noble. But symbols aren't allowed to crack. They can't show weakness. And for Chris, that became the quietest kind of torture. People praised his confidence. They saw the charm, the control, the humor. What they didn't see were the nights he couldn't sleep, the days he felt trapped inside expectations he never asked for. Behind the shield, he was struggling, not with enemies, but with anxiety that followed him everywhere he went. He once said, "I get nervous before every single interview. My heart races, my hands sweat. I tell myself to just breathe." That's the part no one saw, the quiet fight, the silent panic before the smile. There's a kind of loneliness that comes with fame. You're surrounded by millions, yet known by none. Every fan sees a version of you they've built in their mind. Every studio sees a product. And somewhere between the two, the real you starts fading. Chris felt that deeply. He loved acting, but he hated what came with it. The cameras, the questions, the pressure to always seem okay. Because when you play a hero long enough, people start believing you are one. And heroes aren't supposed to feel afraid. But he did. Every day. After the success of Avengers, Chris became the face of hope. But off camera, he often sat alone in his apartment, lights off, phone silent, wondering what it would feel like to live a normal life again. Sometimes he'd paint, sometimes he'd read, sometimes he'd just stare out the window, not thinking, not acting, just existing. That was his peace. He once admitted he considered quitting acting altogether. Not because he hated the art, but because he hated the noise that came with it. The endless interviews, the public scrutiny, the feeling that his entire identity had been stolen by a role he could never escape. That's the thing about icons. They stop being people. They become ideas. And ideas can't breathe. He said it best himself. You don't realize how much of yourself you give away until you stop and there's nothing left. That wasn't Captain America talking. That was Chris, the man behind the armor, whispering a truth the world wasn't ready to hear. As the years went by, the applause got louder, but his peace got quieter. The lights got brighter, but his world grew dimmer. And when the time came to finally say goodbye to the shield, it wasn't just an ending. It was a release. Filming that final scene in Avengers Endgame, handing over the shield, wasn't just a movie moment. It was real. Chris Evans wasn't just retiring a character. He was letting go of a weight he'd carried for almost a decade. The tears weren't acting. They were relief. After the movie wrapped, he walked off set and said, "I'm finally free." But freedom doesn't always come easy. Because once you let go of what defined you for years, who are you after that? For Chris, that was the hardest question of all. He had lived as a hero, a leader, an icon, but never as just himself. And now, at 41, he found himself standing at a crossroads. Fame on one side, peace on the other. For the first time, he chose peace. He moved away from the Hollywood chaos, started spending time in nature, painting, writing, finding joy in silence. He even found love quietly, far away from the spotlight. For once, he wasn't living for cameras. He was living for himself. But the irony of fame is this: the world never stops watching, even when you walk away. Fans began to wonder where he went, why he disappeared, why he seemed distant. But those who truly understood knew, he wasn't gone. He was finally home. Chris Evans' story isn't one of tragedy, it's one of truth. The truth that heroes aren't invincible. They bleed, they break, they feel. And sometimes, the bravest thing a man can do isn't to fight, but to let go. Because behind every smile you see on screen, there's a story you don't. Behind every hero, there's a human. And Chris Evans? He's learning to love that human again. He may have played a man who could save the world. But in the end, all he really wanted was to save himself. And maybe that's the most heroic thing of all. Long before the fame, before the costume, before the cameras ever rolled, there was just a boy named Chris. A boy who dreamed big but felt small, who believed in kindness because the world around him didn't always give it freely. He grew up in Sudbury, Massachusetts, a quiet town of tree-lined streets, small diners, and neighbors who waved when they passed. It wasn't Hollywood, it wasn't glamorous, but it was real. His childhood wasn't filled with money or fame, but with stories, laughter, and lessons about how to stand tall when life felt heavy. His mother, Lisa, worked in the theater. She wasn't famous, but she carried the spirit of an artist. Passionate, creative, alive. From her, Chris learned what it meant to feel things deeply, to see the world not as it is, but as it could be. His father, Bob, was a dentist, practical, grounded, steady. From him, Chris learned discipline and hard work. And between those two worlds, imagination and reality, Chris grew up trying to find balance. But even as a child, he carried something inside that most people never saw. A quiet anxiety. A restless energy. He was the kid who smiled on the outside but worried on the inside. When other kids were carefree, he was already overthinking, already analyzing, already afraid of not being enough. He once said, "I always felt like I was running from something, maybe from myself." School wasn't always easy. He was charming, yes, but sensitive, a mix that made him both loved and misunderstood. He wasn't the loudest, but he felt everything more deeply than he could explain. When others brushed things off, he carried them for days. And so, acting became his outlet, his therapy. It started in school plays. The first time he stepped on stage, something clicked. For a few minutes, he wasn't Chris. He was whoever he wanted to be. Brave, confident, free. That feeling was addictive. The applause wasn't what he loved most, it was the escape. The silence in his mind when he became someone else. When he told his mother he wanted to act for real, she didn't hesitate. She smiled and said, "Then do it. But do it for the right reasons." Those words would stay with him forever. After high school, Chris moved to New York. The city was loud, chaotic, alive, the complete opposite of his quiet hometown. He struggled, like every young dreamer who arrives with nothing but hope. He worked odd jobs, auditioned endlessly, and faced rejection more times than he could count. Every no chipped away at him, but every small yes rebuilt him again. There were nights when he couldn't afford much more than ramen and coffee, nights when he'd question everything. Am I good enough? Am I wasting my life? But then he'd remember the stage, the feeling of being seen, and he'd keep going. His first few roles were small, background characters, short appearances, faces in the crowd. But each one taught him something. He learned to wait, to listen, to understand what makes a moment powerful. Acting wasn't about being famous, it was about being honest. Then, in 2001, he got his first real break, not another teen movie. It wasn't Shakespeare, but it was his foot in the door. Hollywood noticed the handsome kid with the easy charm and sharp eyes. Suddenly, auditions that were once impossible became reachable. But even as his career started to move, he still felt out of place. He wasn't like the others, the ones who thrived on attention, who loved being seen. For Chris, fame was never the dream. The dream was connection, to move people the way stories had moved him as a kid. Over the next few years, he starred in films like The Perfect Score, Cellular, and Fantastic Four. Each step brought him closer to the world he'd wanted, but also further from the world he knew. Success, he realized, came with a quiet cost. On red carpets, he smiled for cameras that never stopped flashing. But inside, he often felt a strange emptiness, a question that never left. Why do I feel so lost, even when I have everything I wanted? It wasn't arrogance. It was confusion. He was grateful, but he was tired. Because the more he achieved, the more he felt he was drifting from who he used to be. He talked once about the early fame, saying, "Everyone's telling you how great you are, but you don't feel great. You feel exposed." That's the thing about dreams. No one tells you they can turn into cages. Back in Massachusetts, his family stayed the same. His mom would still call to ask if he was eating right. His dad would still talk to him about life as if nothing had changed. When he'd go home, he wasn't a celebrity, he was just Chris. And that, more than any award or paycheck, was what kept him grounded. He'd sit in the backyard, barefoot on the grass, just listening to the quiet. No lights, no makeup, no scripts, just the sound of wind through trees. That was peace. And even then, he knew, that's the life he wanted more than fame. But Hollywood doesn't slow down for anyone. Every success demanded another. Every film came with more pressure, more eyes, more expectation. And as his career climbed higher, so did his anxiety. He tried to hide it, in workouts, in work, in laughter, but it never went away. He could play heroes, he could play leaders, but when the lights went off, he still struggled to feel like one. By the time the Marvel opportunity arrived, Chris almost said no. He was tired. The thought of more attention, more fame, more eyes on him, it scared him. When Marvel offered him the role of Captain America, he turned it down. Not once, but twice. He told his friends, "I don't think I can handle it." Imagine that, turning down the role that would define your entire generation because you feared what it might do to your mind. But that's who Chris was. Honest, careful, human. It took a conversation with Robert Downey Jr., and a lot of soul-searching, for him to finally say yes. And when he did, the world would never be the same again. Because the boy from Boston, who once doubted himself, was about to become the man the world would look up to. But deep down, he didn't want to be worshipped. He just wanted to be understood. And that's where the real story begins, not in the fame, not in the films, but in the quiet heart of a man who never stopped asking himself one question: who am I when the cameras stop? Every story of greatness begins with hesitation, that moment when a dream feels too heavy to hold. For Chris Evans, that moment came when the world was asking him to become something larger than life, something even he wasn't sure he could carry. By the late 2000s, he had built a respectable career. Hollywood knew his face, fans recognized his charm, but he was far from the household name he would become. He had already played one superhero, Johnny Storm, the cocky Human Torch in Fantastic Four. It was fun, fast, and loud. But deep down, Chris knew something was missing. The work was exciting, but not fulfilling. It was spectacle without soul. After the sequel, he felt the strange emptiness that often follows success. The cameras stop rolling, the applause fades, and you're left with silence. And in that silence, the mind gets louder. He started to pull back. Took smaller projects, indie films, character roles that let him breathe. But even then, he felt restless. Like a man walking through a crowded room, searching for something he couldn't name. Then one day, the phone rang. It was Marvel. They wanted him for a role in a project that was about to change cinematic history. The role of Steve Rogers, Captain America. Most actors would have jumped at the offer. But Chris didn't. He hesitated. At first, he turned it down. Once. Twice. 3 times. He told his team, "I don't think I want my life to change that much." Because he knew what that kind of fame would mean. The constant attention. The pressure to always be perfect. The way Hollywood builds you up until there's nothing left to build, and then starts tearing you down just to see what happens. He had already tasted fame, and it hadn't brought peace. Why would more of it fix anything? But fate has a way of finding those who try to run from it. Robert Downey Jr. called him personally. So did Kevin Feige. They told him he was perfect for it. That he was the only one who could make the shield feel human. He still wasn't convinced. But one night, he sat alone, thinking about his fears. Not the kind of fear that comes from failure, but the kind that comes from change. The fear of losing yourself in the noise. And then, quietly, he said yes. That single word, yes, changed everything. When Captain America, the first Avenger, hit theaters, the world didn't just see a character. They saw a symbol. A man out of time, who stood for decency, loyalty, and courage in an age that seemed to be losing all three. Chris Evans didn't just play Captain America, he embodied him. The humility, the kindness, the self-doubt, it wasn't acting. It was reflection. Steve Rogers wasn't a costume he put on, it was a mirror held up to who he wanted to be. But with that power came pressure. Every headline, every interview, every public moment became part of the myth. People didn't see Chris anymore. They saw the hero. The perfect man with the perfect morals. And for someone who already struggled with anxiety, that expectation was crushing. He once admitted, when you play a character like that, people project so much onto you. You start wondering if they'd still like you if they saw the real you. And yet, even under the weight of the world's gaze, he carried it with grace. The years that followed, from the Avengers to Endgame, turned him into one of the most recognizable faces on Earth. His movies earned billions. His name became synonymous with honor and leadership. But behind the glory, he fought invisible battles. Before red carpets, he'd pace nervously backstage, trying to calm the shaking in his hands. Before press tours, he'd take deep breaths, rehearsing smiles that didn't always feel natural. Fame had given him everything, and quietly taken everything back. He once said, "People think fame fixes everything. But it doesn't fix what's inside you." Still, he showed up. Always. Not because he loved attention, but because he respected the craft. He loved his crew, his co-stars, his fans. He knew how much the character meant to people. Kids saw Captain America and believed in courage again. Veterans saw him and believed in purpose. Parents saw him and believed in goodness. And so, he gave the world his best, even when he didn't feel his best. There's a scene in The Winter Soldier where Captain America stands against corruption and says, "The price of freedom is high, and it's a price I'm willing to pay." For Chris, that line wasn't just fiction. It was real life. The price of fame was high, and he paid it every day with his privacy, his peace, his sanity. As the years passed, he began to see the difference between the man and the mask. On screen, he was invincible. Off screen, he was human, sometimes too human. He'd wake up some mornings and wonder who he was without the suit, without the shield, without the expectations. And in those quiet moments, he realized the truth, that the world doesn't really love you. It loves the version of you that fits its story. He loved acting, but not the noise that came with it. He loved stories, but hated headlines. He wanted to be remembered for kindness, not charisma. And so, after Endgame, when his contract ended, he didn't ask for more. He didn't chase the next blockbuster. He stepped back. He went home. "I think I've done what I needed to do," he said simply. For millions of fans, it felt like a goodbye. But for Chris, it was survival. He packed his things, left Los Angeles, and returned to Massachusetts. Back to the stillness, the family, the quiet streets that raised him. Because sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is walk away from the world that refuses to stop watching. In interviews, people would ask, "Do you miss it? The attention, the lights, the fame?" And he'd smile and say, "No. I think I've had enough." He wasn't bitter. Just done. The boy who once chased applause had learned the most important truth of all, that peace is louder than applause. He had carried the shield for a decade, given the world its hero, and in doing so, found the courage to stop pretending. Because the real hero's journey wasn't becoming Captain America. It was learning how to stop being him. And for Chris Evans, that was the beginning of freedom. Fame looks golden from the outside. Bright lights, endless applause, the world calling your name. But inside that glow, it can get dark. Darker than anyone dares to admit. For Chris Evans, the fame he once feared had finally caught up to him, and this time, there was nowhere left to hide. At first, it was manageable. The red carpets, the interviews, the questions asked 1,000 times. He could smile through it all, play the part, give them the charm they came for. But deep down, each appearance felt like a performance he didn't sign up for. Every handshake, every flash of the camera chipped a little more away from who he really was. He once said, "Sometimes being recognized doesn't feel like appreciation, it feels like exposure." And in that single sentence lay the quiet truth of his life. The world wanted Captain America every hour of every day, even when Chris just wanted to be Chris. The studio contracts, the press circuits, the global tours, they all blurred together. Airports became more familiar than home. Hotel rooms became more comfortable than his own bed. And through it all, there was this quiet ache, the ache of pretending everything was fine. He'd sit in interviews, smiling, nodding, listening to the same compliments again and again. "You're America's hero, you're such an inspiration." But sometimes, behind that smile, he felt like he was disappearing. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man trying to stay sane in a world that never stopped watching. Anxiety had always followed him, even before the fame. But now it grew louder, sharper, relentless. There were nights before premieres when he couldn't sleep, when the thought of stepping in front of thousands of cameras made his chest tighten. There were mornings when he'd look in the mirror and feel like he was staring at a stranger, someone polished, perfect, and completely hollow. He began to talk about it publicly, not for sympathy, but for honesty. "I get anxiety before every big event," he admitted once. "It doesn't go away. You just learn how to work with it." The internet called it vulnerability. But for Chris, it was survival. Still, he showed up. Because that's what professionals do. Because that's what heroes do. They keep showing up, even when they're falling apart inside. As the Marvel years went on, his fame became suffocating. The noise, the scrutiny, the endless cycle of opinions, it never stopped. Every word he said was dissected. Every gesture was interpreted. Even silence became a headline. He once confessed, "I don't think humans are designed for this kind of exposure. It does something to your brain." And so, when the time came to hang up the shield, he didn't hesitate. He didn't crave another billion-dollar film. He craved stillness. After Endgame, he packed up and moved away from Los Angeles, a city he described as carrying Pavlovian anxiety. He went home to Massachusetts, to the green quiet of the woods, to the stillness that fame had stolen from him. He bought a house not far from where he grew up. Nothing flashy, nothing Hollywood. He began to take long walks again. He'd cook his own meals. He'd sit on the porch and watch the light fade without thinking about scripts or shoots or the next big headline. He once said softly, "I just wanted to go where I could breathe again." But even peace has its ghosts. Because when you spend years being defined by something, walking away doesn't erase it, it only makes the silence louder. At first, the world didn't understand. The tabloids called it a retreat. Fans called it an identity crisis. But in truth, it was neither. It was healing. He wasn't running away from Hollywood. He was walking toward himself. Still, solitude is a strange thing. It heals you, but it also makes you listen, to the thoughts you used to drown out, to the fears you used to ignore. And Chris had many of them. Would people forget him? Would he ever feel purpose again without the cameras? Had he already lived his best years? For someone who had always been driven by goals, slowing down felt like falling. But in that quiet, he began to understand something deeper, that not every chapter of life needs an audience. He started producing small projects, mentoring younger actors, choosing roles that meant something, not just roles that paid well. He learned to say no, something that once terrified him. When asked why he wasn't chasing more blockbusters, he said, "Because I don't need to prove anything anymore. I just want to live." That word, live, carried a weight he'd earned. He had spent so many years existing for others, for fans, studios, headlines, that living for himself felt revolutionary. There were moments of loneliness too. The fame that once filled his calendar now left empty days. Friends were scattered across the world. Some calls went unanswered. Some people only remembered him when they needed something. He'd walk his dog through quiet neighborhoods, unrecognized, unnoticed, and for the first time, he liked it that way. Because for the first time, anonymity wasn't a loss. It was freedom. He spoke about it gently in interviews. "Hollywood stopped feeling real to me. You start to see through it, the noise, the pressure, the constant chase. You realize how much of it is illusion." And he was right. Behind every glossy magazine cover is exhaustion. Behind every perfect red carpet photo is a man trying to breathe. The cracks behind his smile weren't weakness. They were truth. He had carried the expectations of millions, to always be good, to always be grounded, to always be the hero. But even heroes break. Even heroes need rest. And in that break, in that space between applause and silence, Chris Evans found something he'd lost a long time ago, himself. It didn't happen overnight. Healing rarely does. But slowly, gently, he began to forgive himself for wanting peace. For needing space. For choosing quiet over chaos. He learned that stepping away doesn't mean giving up. It means growing up. When asked what happiness meant to him now, he said simply, being home, being still, feeling safe. And in those words lay the quiet redemption of a man who had carried the world's ideals for a decade, and finally learned that he didn't need to carry them anymore. Because sometimes, the real courage isn't in holding the shield. It's in putting it down. It's strange how silence can feel louder than applause. 4 years, Chris Evans lived surrounded by noise, interviews, cameras, fans chanting his name, and then, suddenly, it all stopped. No more daily headlines. No more schedules packed from dawn till midnight. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that forces you to face everything you've been running from. At first, it was peace. The stillness he'd been craving. But peace can be deceptive. Because when the noise fades, the mind starts whispering things you don't want to hear. For Chris, those whispers turned into storms. He'd wake up some mornings with no reason to get out of bed. The motivation that once drove him to train, act, and perform, it was gone. He wasn't tired of work. He was tired of himself. The endless expectations, the pressure to be perfect, the fear of disappointing anyone, they had left scars he couldn't see but could feel every day. He once admitted quietly, "There were times I just didn't want to be seen. Not because I hated the world, but because I didn't know who I was in it anymore." Fame had built him up into an idea, but it had also taken away his reality. He'd sit by the window at night, staring at the empty street outside, wondering how everything that once felt like a dream had become a cage. His mind wouldn't stop replaying old memories, moments from the sets, red carpets, interviews, wondering if he had said too much, smiled too little, seemed too tired. It's the curse of the overthinker, to replay everything until it hurts. Some days, he'd distract himself, hiking, cooking, fixing small things around the house. Anything to keep from thinking. But the thoughts always came back. What if his best days were behind him? What if stepping away had cost him everything? What if the world had already moved on? For a man who had lived under constant validation, the absence of it felt like erasure. He once said, "The hardest part of fame isn't losing privacy. It's losing purpose." And that's exactly what it felt like. A life suddenly stripped of direction. 4 months, he struggled quietly. No dramatic headlines, no public breakdowns, just silent battles fought behind closed doors. He didn't tell many people. Because in Hollywood, vulnerability can be mistaken for weakness. And for someone who had played the symbol of strength for a generation, weakness wasn't an option. But deep down, he was exhausted, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. He had built his life around being needed, by fans, by studios, by everyone except himself. And now, no one was calling. That emptiness broke him in ways no critic or scandal ever could. He'd scroll through old photos sometimes, premieres, events, behind-the-scenes moments, and feel like he was looking at someone else's life. There was the smile, the confidence, the glow of success. But behind those images, he remembered the panic attacks, the sleepless nights, the quiet voice in his head asking, "How long can you keep this up?" He couldn't. Not anymore. That's when he hit his breaking point. It wasn't a single moment. It was a slow collapse, the kind that builds quietly over time until one day, you realize you've been standing on broken ground. He stopped answering calls. Stopped going out. Stopped pretending. Friends grew worried. Some tried to reach him. Others simply assumed he needed space. But the truth was darker. He was sinking into himself, and he didn't know how to climb back out. Anxiety became a constant companion, unpredictable, suffocating, cruel. Even simple things like walking into a cafe or making small talk felt unbearable. He once said in an interview, "Anxiety doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just whispers that you're not enough, until you start believing it." And that belief nearly destroyed him. Nights turned long. Days felt heavy. He'd lie awake at 3 a.m., his thoughts racing faster than sleep could catch them. Every "what if" became a weapon. What if I never feel normal again? What if I'm not built for peace? What if fame broke something in me that can't be fixed? He didn't realize it then, but this was the beginning of healing, the breakdown before the breakthrough. Because sometimes you have to lose yourself completely before you can find the version of you that was never built for the world's approval. Still, in those dark months, he didn't see it as healing. He saw it as failure. Failure to be strong. Failure to stay grateful. Failure to live up to the image that everyone else had created for him. He once said quietly, "I felt guilty for being unhappy. Like I didn't have the right to feel this way after everything I'd been given." But pain doesn't care about privilege. It doesn't care how successful, rich, or loved you are. It finds its way in, and when it does, it demands to be felt. It took him months to admit he needed help. Months of denial, isolation, and quiet suffering before he finally reached out to his therapist, someone he had trusted for years. That conversation changed everything. He talked for hours, about fame, fear, loneliness, and the exhaustion of pretending to be okay. And for the first time in a long time, someone listened without expectation. No spotlight. No judgment. No Captain America label. Just a man trying to understand himself. He began to rebuild slowly, not through work, but through living. Small steps, journaling, meditation, talking to family more often, reconnecting with friends who saw him for who he was, not what he represented. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't headline-worthy. But it was real. He started to realize that healing wasn't about becoming who he was before fame. It was about creating someone new, someone softer, calmer, more grounded. He once said, "The hardest part was forgiving myself for breaking." But that forgiveness became the turning point. He began to see the beauty in slowing down, the value in saying no, the strength in showing up honestly, even when it meant admitting he wasn't okay. And that honesty, that rawness, slowly pulled him back from the edge. The man who once felt trapped by his own success began to rediscover life, not as a star, but as a human being. And for Chris Evans, that was the first real victory in years. Because sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do isn't fighting villains on screen. It's sitting alone in the dark, facing your demons, and choosing to keep going. Healing never announces itself with fanfare. It doesn't walk in with music or miracles. It begins in silence, in the smallest, almost invisible moments when something inside you decides not to give up. For Chris Evans, healing began like that, quietly, almost without his notice. It was the morning he woke up and realized the sun looked different. Warmer somehow. He made coffee, sat by the window, and for the first time in months, he didn't rush to check his phone. He just sat there, breathing. That single breath was the beginning of his comeback. Not the kind you see on magazine covers or red carpets, but the kind that happens inside, where no one's watching. He started rebuilding his life piece by piece, like a puzzle he'd once thrown away. Every small act, cooking his meals, walking his dog, calling his mother, became a quiet declaration that he was still here. He found peace in ordinary things. The sound of rain tapping the roof. The smell of coffee. The feel of sunlight on his face after a storm. These were things fame had taken from him without him even realizing it. He began writing again, not scripts or statements, but thoughts. Fragments of memories, reflections, confessions. His journal became a safe place, a mirror that didn't judge him for being human. He'd write lines like, "Maybe happiness isn't something you chase. Maybe it's something that waits patiently for you to stop running." And in those words, he found pieces of himself he thought were gone forever. He spent more time at home, surrounded by his family, the people who knew him before the world did. They didn't ask about films or fame. They asked if he'd eaten, if he'd slept, if he was okay. Those questions, simple, genuine, reminded him of what really mattered. He began walking again, long walks without purpose. Just him, the road, and the sound of his own thoughts. At first, the silence felt heavy. But slowly, it turned into comfort, like the world was giving him permission to breathe again. He once said, "I used to think success was about being everywhere. Now I realize it's about being fully present where you are." And that presence changed everything. When he returned to acting, he did it differently. No grand announcements, no marketing frenzy. Just quiet projects that spoke to him. Smaller roles, deeper characters, stories that meant something. He wasn't chasing relevance anymore. He was chasing truth. The man who once lived under the world's spotlight was now content in the glow of a simple lamp, reading scripts that touched his soul instead of his ego. It wasn't a comeback designed for applause. It was a return to peace, and that was far greater. There were days when the old fears still whispered that he wasn't doing enough, that he might fade away. But instead of running from those thoughts, he learned to sit with them. He learned that strength wasn't about silencing your demons. It was about listening to them, understanding them, and then deciding they no longer control you. He started giving interviews again, but this time with honesty. He spoke about anxiety, fear, and the cost of being admired by millions but known by none. He said, "You can have everything people dream of and still feel lost. But if you find yourself again, you've already won." Those words hit differently, not just for him, but for the world watching. Because his quiet honesty made others feel less alone. People who struggled silently with their own anxiety, their own feeling of emptiness, saw in him the proof that even heroes can hurt and heal. He became an advocate for mindfulness, therapy, and emotional well-being. Not as a brand or a campaign, but as a man who had lived it. And little by little, the narrative around him began to change. He wasn't just the man who played Captain America anymore. He was the man who showed what courage looks like when the cameras stop rolling. He began smiling again, not the red carpet smile, but the kind that comes from a heart that's finally at peace. He traveled, read more, fell in love quietly, focused on his home, his friends, and a simple life filled with laughter, routine, and gratitude. He once joked, "I used to think I needed the world to see me. Now I just need to see the world." And that became his truth. Because real growth doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like someone sitting under a tree, drinking coffee, with no agenda other than being alive. That's what his comeback was, a gentle return to self, not a sprint toward fame. People who met him during this time said there was a calmness about him. A quiet steadiness. A sense of peace that only comes when you've walked through chaos and survived. He no longer chased perfection. He embraced the mess, the flaws, the scars, the cracks in the armor. Because those cracks weren't weaknesses. They were proof that he had lived, fallen, and risen again. When asked in an interview what happiness meant to him now, He smiled softly and said, "It's waking up and not needing to prove anything to anyone." That single line carried the weight of everything he'd been through. The pain, the pressure, the fame, the silence, all of it had led him here. To a life that wasn't about performing anymore, but about being. And in that simplicity, he found a kind of freedom that no award, no box office record, no global fame could ever match. He had finally made peace with himself. And that was the quiet comeback the world didn't see coming, because it wasn't meant to be seen. It was meant to be felt. There comes a point in every journey when the noise fades, the lights dim, and what's left is just truth. No costumes. No applause. No expectations. Just a person, standing face to face with everything they once ran from. For Chris Evans, that moment didn't happen on a film set or a red carpet. It happened quietly, one evening, sitting on his porch, watching the sky turn gold. The world he once conquered felt far away now, like a story he'd read long ago. And for the first time, he didn't miss it. He realized that peace isn't something fame can buy. It's something you earn, often after losing everything you thought mattered. He once said, "Captain America isn't who I am. He's who I wanted to be." But somewhere along the way, he discovered that being human, with all his flaws and fears, was far more powerful than any superhero could ever be. People had always called him a hero, but he never believed it. Not because he doubted his worth, but because he understood what real heroism looked like. It wasn't in saving the world on screen. It was in facing your demons when no one's watching. It was in forgiving yourself for being fragile. It was in standing up over and over, even when your soul felt tired. That was the real Chris Evans, not the symbol, not the star, but the man. He learned that legacy isn't built through fame, it's built through kindness. The way you treat people when you have nothing to prove. The way you show up for the ones you love. The way you make peace with your own reflection. 4 years, he'd lived under the weight of expectation. Millions saw him as untouchable, the perfect gentleman, the moral compass, the Hollywood golden boy. But perfection is a lonely place. And so, he chose something braver. Authenticity. He began to live without the mask. No longer afraid to show when he was tired, sad, unsure. He spoke more about the beauty of slowing down, the value of therapy, the quiet power of love. He stopped being the image, and started being the truth. And in doing that, something remarkable happened. People loved him more. Not for his roles, but for his realness. For showing that even those we idolize are still just people trying to figure it out. His legacy became something much deeper than fame. It became about permission, the permission for others to be honest about their pain, to seek help, to stop pretending. He turned vulnerability into strength. And that might be his greatest role yet. Because when you strip away the fame, the interviews, the awards, what remains is a man who never stopped learning how to live. He found love quietly, far away from the cameras. He found joy in simplicity, in laughter shared over dinner, in walks through his hometown, in the smell of the ocean after rain. He found peace in being enough, exactly as he was. He no longer needed to be Captain America to feel strong. Because he had already fought, and won, the most human battle of all, the one within. Somewhere, that old shield still sits in his home. Not as a trophy, not as a symbol, but as a reminder. A reminder of a chapter that shaped him, but didn't define him. A reminder that even heroes outgrow their armor. He once said in an interview, "If I could give one message to my younger self, it'd be this: you don't have to earn peace. You just have to allow it." That's the kind of wisdom that doesn't come from scripts, it comes from scars. His story, in the end, isn't tragic. It's human. Because tragedy isn't just about pain, it's about transformation. It's about losing parts of yourself so you can find the ones that truly matter. And that's exactly what he did. He found himself again. Not in the applause, not in the fame, but in the quiet. He became the kind of man who chooses morning walks over premieres. The kind who chooses listening over talking. The kind who understands that sometimes, Walking away is the bravest way to stay true. And maybe that's why his story resonates so deeply, because it isn't about a fall from grace. It's about finding grace after the fall. He taught us that strength doesn't mean having it all together. It means being real enough to admit when you don't. He showed that courage isn't in pretending to be perfect, it's in standing in your truth, unmasked, unfiltered, unafraid. And that is the kind of hero the world will never forget. Because long after the lights fade, long after the roles end, and the world moves on to the next face on the screen, stories like his remain. Stories that remind us that behind every icon is a person, behind every smile is a struggle, and behind every mask is a beating heart that just wants to be seen. That's the story of Chris Evans, not the superhero, not the celebrity, but the man who dared to stop performing and start living. And maybe that's the truest definition of strength. He once said softly, "I don't need to be remembered for what I did. I just want to be remembered for who I was." And he will be. Not because of the shield he carried, but because of the peace he found after putting it down. Because the tragedy of Chris Evans was never really about loss. It was about rediscovery. The rediscovery of self, of love, of life, beyond the fame, beyond the noise. And as his story closes, one truth lingers like a whisper through time. Fame fades. Stories end. But peace, real peace, stays. Because sometimes, the bravest thing a man can do is finally rest. If this story touched your heart, remember, every smile hides a story, every hero has a human side. Subscribe for more true Hollywood journeys, stories of pain, courage, and redemption behind the spotlight, and beyond the fame.